In the spring of 1979, a farmer named Denny Sloane drove past his neighbor's farm in Shelby County, Indiana, and saw a brand-new large green tractor being unloaded from a flatbed. He knew what it was. He had seen the dealer's brochures. His neighbor, a man named Roy Krebs, had been talking about the machine since the previous fall. The horsepower, the hydraulics, the cab improvements, the specific advantages over what Roy was currently running. Roy had said, "Denny, you should look at one yourself. 40 more horsepower than what you've got. It makes a real difference by May." Denny had looked at the brochure Roy had shown him. He had looked at the horsepower numbers. He had looked at the payment numbers, which were on the back page in smaller print than the horsepower numbers. He had handed the brochure back to Roy and said, "I'll think about it." He had thought about it. He had sat at the kitchen table with his repair log and his operating account statements in the brochure and had done the arithmetic. The new machine was $31,400. Down payment, $5,000. Financed $26,400 at 10.5% over 60 months. Monthly payment, $567. Denny had written $567 on a piece of paper. He had looked at it. He had then written land payment. He had looked at that. He had called the dealer the following Monday and told the salesman he was going to pass. The salesman had said, "Denny, you're going to be the only farmer in Shelby County not running that machine within the next 2 years." Denny had said, "Probably." He had hung up. He had not called Roy and told him he was not buying the new machine because Roy had not asked. Roy had bought one. Roy was satisfied with his. The following spring, the spring of 1980, Denny had taken $5,000, the down payment he had not made, and had put it in the operating account. He had then made 12 payments of $567 per month that he was not making to the equipment dealer, and those 12 payments had also gone into the operating account. By March of 1981, Denny had $11,804 more in his operating account than he had had in March of 1979 before the purchase he did not make. In March of 1981, Roy Krebs had received a letter from his lender. The letter was about his operating note. Roy's operating note had been extended the previous 2 years to accommodate the equipment payment that had been running simultaneously. The lender was now concerned about the combined debt service, the equipment note and the operating note together, relative to Roy's projected revenue at the corn prices that had been falling since 1980. Roy had called Denny. He had said, "I'm having a conversation with the bank about my operating position." Denny had said, "I know." He had paused. He had said, "What do you need?" Roy had said, "Nothing right now." He had paused. "I just wanted to tell someone who would understand." Denny had said, "I understand." He did understand. He had been looking at the same operating position Roy was describing, the same falling corn prices, the same input costs, the same land values that were beginning to soften. And he had been looking at it without the equipment note. Roy was looking at it with the equipment note on top. The farm crisis of the early 1980s is a matter of record in Shelby County and every other agricultural county in the Midwest. Corn prices fell from $3.11 per bushel in 1980 to $2.32 in 1982. Interest rates ran from 10 to 21%. Land values, which had been rising through the late 1970s, began to fall. Operations that had taken on debt during the expansion years, equipment debt, operating debt, land debt, found themselves servicing those debts at falling commodity prices and rising interest rates simultaneously. Roy Krebs was one of these operations, not catastrophically. Roy was a careful man and had not overextended in land or operating credit. But the equipment note and the extended operating note together put him in a position where, by the fall of 1982, he needed to sell something to restore his debt service ratio to the range his lender required. He sold the South 120 acres. Let me tell you about the almost quit moment for Denny, because it happened not during the farm crisis, but during the spring of 1979, when he was sitting at the kitchen table with the brochure and the piece of paper that said $567. Denny had been farming 320 acres of Shelby County ground since 1971. He was 38 years old in 1979. He was a serious farmer who understood that the new machine Roy was buying was genuinely better than what Denny was running. More horsepower, better hydraulics, a more comfortable cab, longer service intervals. Roy was not wrong about any of these things. Denny had sat at the kitchen table with the brochure and had thought, I am going to be the farmer in this county who is running an older machine while everyone else upgrades. That is going to be uncomfortable. The salesman had said it directly. You are going to be the only farmer in Shelby County not running this machine in 2 years. That was probably an exaggeration, but it was not entirely wrong. The new machine was moving through the county the way new machines always move through the county, and in 2 years, most of Denny's neighbors would have one. He had thought about being the farmer with the older machine. He had thought about what that meant at the elevator and at the co-op and at the Farm Bureau meetings. The specific social pressure of being the man who does not have what everyone else has. The man whose equipment choices are visibly different from the norm. He had sat with this for a while. Then he had written on the piece of paper below $567 per month the words Roy's Farm. He had written 120 acres South Field. He had written what would that cost at today's prices. He had not bought the South 120 acres in 1979. He had simply written it on the piece of paper as a placeholder for what the $567 per month could be doing instead. In the fall of 1982, when Roy needed to sell the South 120 acres to restore his debt service ratio, Denny had enough in the operating account to buy it. He had been putting the money he was not paying to the equipment dealer into the account since 1979. He had been putting additional money from the operating surplus of a farm running without equipment debt. By the fall of 1982, he had the liquidity. He had bought the South 120 acres for $1,100 per acre, $132,000 for ground that Roy had paid $1,900 per acre for in 1976. And that was now being sold at crisis prices, because the equipment note had put Roy's debt service ratio in a position that required selling something. Roy had needed to sell. Denny had been positioned to buy. The equipment decision in 1979 had created the position that made the 1982 purchase possible. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer and tell me in the comments, has an equipment decision ever put someone in a position to buy or sell at the wrong time? Let me tell you about the moment when Roy understood what had happened, because Roy was not a foolish man, and he came to understand it clearly. In the spring of 1983, the season after the sale, Roy had come to Denny's farm. He had said, "You bought my South 120. Denny had said yes. Roy had said, "At $1,100. Denny had said yes. Roy had said, "I paid $1,900 for it in 1976. Denny had said, "I know." Roy had been quiet. He had said, "What did you pay for the new machine? For the green tractor?" Denny had said, "I didn't buy one." Roy had stopped. He had said, "You passed on the machine in 1979. Denny had said, "Yes." Roy had said, "And you've been putting the payment into the operating account since 1979. Denny had said, "Since the spring of 1979. Yes. Roy had done the arithmetic in his head. He had been quiet for a long time. He had said, "Denny, you bought my South 120 acres with the payments I made to the dealer on the machine you didn't buy." Denny had said, roughly, "Yes." Roy had looked at the south field visible from Denny's farm lane. He had said, "That's the damnedest thing I've ever heard." Denny had said, "It's not complicated." Roy had said, "No." He had paused. "It's not." He had said, "I made the payment and you bought the field." Denny had said, "I bought a field. You got the machine." Roy had said, "I don't have the machine anymore." Denny had said, "I know." The new green tractor had been traded in 1985. The note was done. The machine was 6 years old. A newer and larger machine was available. The trade-in cycle was running the same way it ran for everyone who entered it. The machine Roy had bought in 1979 had depreciated from $31,400 to a trade-in value of approximately $14,000 by 1985. The net cost of the machine across its 6 years of ownership after the trade-in credit, approximately $23,400 in principal and interest. Roy had bought a machine for $23,400 in net cost and had sold ground for $228,000 less than he had paid for it. The connection between these two facts was not direct. Roy would have bought the machine regardless, and the farm crisis would have created pressure regardless. And the specific combination of events that required selling the South 120 might have occurred differently without the equipment note. But the equipment note had been the proximate cause of the need to sell at the moment when the market price of farmland was at its lowest point in a decade. The machine was gone. The ground was Denny's. Let me tell you about the South 120 acres today because the long-run accounting closes the story. Denny bought the South 120 acres for $132,000 in 1982. He has farmed it for 42 years. Its current value is approximately $1,320,000, approximately $11,000 per acre for Shelby County Indiana farm ground in 2024. The 1,000% increase in value from 1982 to 2024 represents the specific compounding of agricultural land values in central Indiana over 4 decades. Against the $31,400 that Denny did not spend on the new green tractor in 1979, the $132,000 he spent on the South 120 in 1982 looks like a large multiple. But the $31,400 machine had been depreciated to $14,000 by 1985 when it was traded. The $132,000 in land is now $1,320,000. These are not comparable assets. The machine is a depreciating asset. The ground is not. Calvin Mast had said it in Mercer County, Ohio. Denny Sloane had said it differently in Shelby County, Indiana. The sentence came out the same. Always put the money in the thing that stays. Roy had bought the machine. Denny had bought the ground. 42 years later, the machine is gone and the ground is worth 10 times what Denny paid for it. Roy understood this. He had said it himself in the spring of 1983. I made the payment and you bought the field. He had bought the machine. Denny had bought the field. The field stayed. The machine's trade-in value is on a ledger sheet somewhere in a dealer's records from 1985. The field is still in Shelby County, still being farmed by Denny's son, still producing corn and soybeans on the same ground that Roy sold at $1,100 per acre at the bottom of the farm crisis. Denny's son runs the operation now. He has never made an equipment payment. He learned this from Denny the same way Denny learned it from the piece of paper on the kitchen table in 1979. The piece of paper that had $567 on it, and the words Roy's Farm below it. He had not bought the machine. He had bought the farm. The new green tractor had 40 more horsepower. Roy had said it makes a real difference by May. It did make a difference by May. It also made a difference by 1982, when the note and the operating debt combined to put Roy in a position that required selling ground at crisis prices. 40 more horsepower, 120 fewer acres. The difference either way was real. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer. Hit the bell. Tell me in the comments, what equipment decision on your farm turned into a land decision? He put the payment money in the bank. He bought his neighbor's farm when the note came due. That is the whole story. Let me tell you about what Denny was actually running in 1979, because the claim that the new machine had 40 more horsepower only matters if you know what Denny was working with and what 40 horsepower more would have done for his operation. Denny's primary tractor in 1979 was a 1968 large vintage green machine with approximately 4,200 hours. It had been his primary machine for 11 years. It had 91 horsepower at the PTO. Not a small number in 1968 when he had bought it used, and still a workable number in 1979 for a 320-acre corn and soybean operation. He ran a 6-row planter, a 6-row cultivator, and a 13-foot disc. All of these implements were sized for the 91-horsepower machine. None of them required more power than the machine could deliver. The new machine Roy was buying had 130 horsepower at the PTO, 40 more horsepower. This was real. 130 horsepower could pull a larger planter, a wider disc, a heavier toolbar. For Roy, who was farming 400 acres and had bought larger implements to match, the 130 horsepower machine made operational sense. Roy could run an 8-row planter behind it and cover more acres per day during the critical planting window. For Denny, who was farming 320 acres with 6-row equipment, the 40 additional horsepower would have been largely unused. His existing 6-row planter did not need 130 horsepower. His 13-foot disc did not need 130 horsepower. He would have been paying for horsepower that his current implement package could not use, and that his 320-acre operation did not require. This is the part of the horsepower argument the dealer's brochure did not address. The brochure said 40 more horsepower, as though more horsepower was always better, which is true in the same sense that a larger house is always bigger. The question is not whether more horsepower is more. The question is whether the additional horsepower produces additional value that justifies its cost on a specific operation at a specific scale. On Denny's 320-acre operation with 6-row equipment, the answer was no. On Roy's 400-acre operation with larger implements, the answer might have been yes, if the farm crisis had not intervened. Denny had understood this from the brochure arithmetic. He had noted in his kitchen table calculation that his current machine was running at approximately 75 to 80% of its rated PTO horsepower at peak field load. He had headroom. He was not capacity limited on his 6-row equipment with his 91-horsepower machine. He was not leaving acres unplanted because his planter could not keep up. He was not losing harvest days because his equipment was undersized. He had been able to farm 320 acres efficiently with what he had. The new machine's 40 additional horsepower would not have made him more efficient. It would have made him faster in ways his operation did not need him to be faster. The salesman had said, 40 more horsepower. It makes a real difference by May. Denny had said, I'll think about it. What he had thought was, the difference it makes by May does not match the payment it costs by the 15th of every month for 60 months. He had been right. Roy had bought the horsepower he needed for his operation. Denny had identified that his operation did not need it and declined accordingly. Let me tell you about the specific financial position Denny was in by the fall of 1982, when Roy needed to sell, because understanding Denny's position explains why he was able to buy rather than having to sell. Denny had not made equipment payments since 1974, when he had paid off the note on his 1968 machine, which he had bought used and financed for 3 years, his only equipment note in his farming career. From 1974 to 1982 was 8 years of farming without equipment debt. In those 8 years, his farm had generated operating surplus that had not been consumed by equipment payments. He had invested this surplus conservatively, and some in the operating account, some in a farm improvement fund he kept separately, and $8,400 in early 1980 in the purchase of 20 acres that had been part of his original lease, and that his landlord had offered him at below market before listing publicly. By the fall of 1982, Denny had approximately $38,000 in liquid operating account funds, no equipment debt, no land debt, beyond a small remainder on a 1975 land purchase that was nearly paid off, and the 20 acres he had bought in early 1980. His operating position was strong. His debt service was minimal. He had the financial flexibility to make an opportunistic purchase when the opportunity arose. Roy had approximately $14,000 in equity on the green machine that was now 6 years from being fully paid off, a fully drawn operating note that had been extended twice in the previous 2 years, and a combined debt service ratio that his lender had said needed improvement. Both men had farmed through the same falling corn prices and rising interest rates and softening land values of the early 1980s farm crisis. One of them had the financial position to buy at crisis prices. The other had the financial position that required selling at crisis prices. The difference between the two positions had been built across 8 years of different equipment decisions. Denny had understood this clearly in the spring of 1983 when Roy came to the farm. He had not said it as a lesson or a lecture. He had said, "I didn't buy one." He had said, "Since the spring of 1979, yes." Roy had said, "I made the payment and you bought the field." Denny had said, "Roughly, yes." That was the whole conversation. Roy had named what had happened accurately and without accusation. Denny had confirmed it without elaborating. Neither man had needed to say anything more because the south 120 acres visible from Denny's farm lane said it already. Let me tell you what Denny told his son about the kitchen table piece of paper, because the piece of paper is the whole system compressed into a single decision-making tool. Denny's son Gary had come to the farm in 1991 when he was 24 years old. He had been farming alongside Denny for 2 years when a new large green machine came to the county, a newer model, more horsepower than the one Roy had bought in 1979, a cab with more features, a financing package that the dealer had designed for exactly the kind of farm Gary and Denny were running. Gary had been interested. He had come to Denny with the brochure. Denny had looked at the brochure. He had said, "Sit down." He had taken out a piece of paper. He had written the monthly payment at the top. He had written it large, not small, not tucked in a corner the way the dealer put it on the back page, but large and centered at the top. He had said, "That's what we pay every month for 60 months. He had paused. Now right below it, what we'd have instead. Gary had looked at the piece of paper. He had said, "We'd have the machine." Denny had said, "And what would we not have?" Gary had thought about it. He had said, "The payment money." Denny had said, "What could the payment money be doing instead?" Gary had thought about this longer. He had said, "Going into the account." Denny had said, "And what does the account do when it's full enough?" Gary had said, "Buys ground." Denny had nodded. He had said, "Write that below the payment." He had paused. "Now tell me which line is worth more in 20 years. Gary had looked at the 2 lines on the piece of paper. He had said, "The ground." Denny had said, "Every time." He had said, "The machine depreciates. The ground does not." He had said, "You are going to be offered new machines your whole farming life. Every one of them will have more horsepower than the one before it. Every one of them will have features the previous one did not have. Every salesman will tell you that 40 more horsepower makes a real difference by May." He had paused. "Write the payment on the piece of paper. Write what you'd have instead." He had looked at Gary. "Pick the line that stays." Gary has been picking the line that stays since 1993. He has never made an equipment payment. He bought 80 acres in 2001, 60 acres in 2008, and 40 acres in 2015. The farm is 520 acres now. The 320 Denny started with, the 120 from Roy in 1982, the 80 in 2001, the 60 in 2008, the 40 in 2015. Roy's son farms the remaining 280 acres of Roy's original farm. He runs a new green tractor. It has more horsepower than the one Roy bought in 1979. It makes a real difference by May. Denny's equipment is older and paid for. Gary's equipment is older and paid for. The south 120 acres that Roy sold at crisis prices in 1982 is currently worth $1,320,000. Roy's son's farm is 280 acres. Denny's farm, now Gary's farm, is 520 acres. Roy had said, "I made the payment and you bought the field." Gary is still buying the field. Every year that he does not make an equipment payment, there is money in the account that can buy the thing that stays. The piece of paper with the payment on one line and the ground on the other has been in the top drawer of the farm desk since Denny showed it to Gary in 1993. Gary has shown it to his own son, who is 16 and learning what the two lines mean. Pick the line that stays. It is always the same line. It is never the machine. Let me tell you about Roy Krebs in the years after the sale, because Roy does not disappear from this story, and his account of it matters. Roy had sold the South 120 acres in the fall of 1982. He had used the proceeds to retire the extended operating note and restore his debt service ratio to the range his lender required. He had kept the farm, the remaining 280 acres, the buildings, the equipment, including the green machine that was 3 years from being fully paid off. He had not lost his farm. This matters. The farm crisis years took many farms in Shelby County and the surrounding counties, and Roy's was not among them, because Roy had been careful in his non-equipment decisions. His land purchase leverage was modest, his operating credit usage was disciplined, and the equipment note, while it had compounded his position, had not broken it. He had sold 120 acres and survived the crisis intact. He had also continued farming well. His yields on the remaining 280 acres tracked consistently above the Shelby County average through the 1980s and 1990s. He was a skilled farmer who knew his ground and managed his inputs correctly. The equipment note had not impaired his farming ability. It had impaired his financial flexibility at the wrong moment. He had come to terms with this over the years in the way that honest men come to terms with the consequences of clear decisions made for real reasons. He had bought the new machine because he wanted more horsepower and was willing to pay for it. The farm crisis had turned a manageable equipment note into a liquidity problem that required selling ground. This was not primarily Roy's fault. The farm crisis was not primarily anyone's individual fault. But the equipment note had been Roy's choice, and Roy understood that clearly. He had said to Denny in 1983, "I made the payment and you bought the field." He had said it without bitterness, as a statement of arithmetic. He was a man who could see clearly what had happened and say it plainly. Denny had said, "I bought a field. You got the machine." Roy had said, "I don't have the machine anymore." He had traded it in 1985. It had gone into the dealer's used inventory and had eventually been sold to a farm in a different county, and had eventually been traded again, and eventually been parted out or scrapped or sent to the collector market, depending on its condition at the end of its useful life. Machines follow paths like this. The path ends somewhere that is not the farm where they started. The South 120 acres has not left the county. It has not left the farm it went to in 1982. It is in Shelby County, Indiana, farmed by Gary, in the same condition it was in when Roy put it on the market at $1,100 per acre. Actually better condition, because Gary has been tiling and managing the organic matter the way he manages all his ground, because the thing you own, you take care of. Roy's son farms the remaining 280 acres well. He runs current equipment. He manages his debt carefully. He has learned from his father what the equipment note can do at the wrong moment. and he is more conservative in his financing than his father was. Roy's son and Gary have a good relationship. They farm adjacent ground. They share some equipment during peak seasons. They help each other in the ways that adjacent farm families have always helped each other in Shelby County. Roy's son has never said what his father said. He has not needed to. Both of them know what happened in 1982 and what determined who was on which side of the transaction. Denny said, "Pick the line that stays. It is always the same line." The machine that Roy bought in 1979 is gone. The 120 acres that Roy sold in 1982 is still in Shelby County, still producing, still worth 10 times the price Roy got for it. The line that stays is always the ground. Roy knew this. He said it himself. He made the payment, and Denny bought the field. The field is still there. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer. Hit the bell. 40 more horsepower and 120 fewer acres. Pick the line that stays.